Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the November session of our annual update, Minimize Risks Related to Holiday Party Gatherings. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're really excited to be talking about this topic and generally to even be considering or talking about in-person holiday gatherings after the last few years that we've had. Couple of housekeeping things before we get started. For December's annual update, we are putting together a video montage instead of a webinar. So we're going all out for everyone. We know that December can be a really hectic and busy month for a lot of our clients with year-end engagements, getting ready for the new year. So folks should all be on the lookout for an email with a link to the video montage of risks and things to keep at top of mind for the new year. And that'll be sent out the second week of December. So if you're not on our listserv, you're going to want to make sure that you're on our listserv. It'll be posted to the blog, so you'll get kind of all of that information. Additionally, as we come to the end of the year, let's look to the new year. And we are actually going to do the annual update in person next year. We are changing it around a little bit for safety purposes. We're going to do 2 shorter and smaller sessions. So the first one's going to be on Thursday, January 26th from 1 to 4 p.m. It's going to be located in Waddell's Portland office. And it'll have 4 sessions, but that's going to be part 1 of the legal year in review. And then the second session, which is going to be the same exact material, but at a different time, it's going to be Thursday, February 2nd from 9 a.m. to noon. And that's also going to be here in Waddell's offices. Same content, but we're doing 2 smaller sessions for individuals for safety purposes. An invite for those in-person sessions will be emailed out after Thanksgiving, and we look forward to finally seeing so many of you in person again. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Tawny Alvarez. I'm excited to be talking about this topic today with my colleague, Emily Waddell. We're both located out of the Portland main office, but are licensed throughout New England to help with any of the needs that you may have for a labor and employment standard. And with that, you have links to the webinar material, to all of these slides are available through the chat function, and they'll also be sent out after this presentation, as well as a link to the recorded session so that you can share that with colleagues if they were unable to attend. So let's jump to that first slide. So everyone last night should have received an email that confirmed their registration and also provided the link for today. Additionally, you would have seen attached to that document something we like to refer to as the fa-la-la standard. And specifically, it's our hope that this one document takes and concisely puts into one document everything that we've been talking about during the course of today's presentation. So instead of when you're planning your party, you pull up all of our slide deck with all of our risks laid out and a discussion as to all of that. Instead, think about the fa-la-la, and that's going to be family, considering elements of family, which is going to come up throughout the course of today's presentation, alcohol, whether to serve alcohol, if you do serve alcohol, different steps that you should take in order to potentially limit liability, location. Okay, see how we're doing fa-la-la? So we're on location. Okay, attendance is going to be a really big question. We're going to get into that specifically from some wage and hour and workers' comp perspectives. Liability insurance. So, my acronym wasn't perfect, but it was pretty close. Making sure that you have the right insurance for the events that you're hosting. And then finally, the atmosphere, kind of what it looks like, the vibe that you're creating. Vibe, that's very much my 11-year-old daughter's new word. So making sure that it has a vibe that is minimizing risk generally. So if you keep all of these kind of concepts at top of mind when you are planning it, we hope that we're going to help you limit some liability. But now let me turn it over to Emily so that she can give you a roadmap of what we're going to be talking about today.
Thanks, Tawny. So taking that follow law standard and looking at some areas of concern and areas where you're going to want to limit your liability, holiday parties surprisingly can result in a wide variety of claims. And these are just some of the major areas of concern that we're going to explore today. So those include religious discrimination, wage and hour concerns, workers' compensation, and sex harassment. And some of these may, as you're looking at the list, jump out to you as areas where you would expect to see some claims. For example, a lot of the holidays that are celebrated in December have religious meetings. So religious discrimination, that might be something that kind of came top of mind when you thought of hosting a holiday party. But some other areas like wage and hour and workers' compensation might not be, kind of top of mind when we think about liability associated with holiday parties. But we're going to take the time to go through all of these today. And to start, we are going to go through religious discrimination, and Tawny is going to take us through that.
So if you've attended any of our presentations in the past, you know that I believe very strongly that if you have questions, please put them in the chat, put them in the QA at the time in which we're talking about the topic, so that we can integrate your question into the discussion, so that because in most cases, your question is a question that a colleague likely has as well. So we want to hear those questions. But religious discrimination. What do Emily and Tawny mean when we say that there's risk concerning a claim regarding religious discrimination? I want to preface this with this dialogue is really in reference to secular employers. So if you are a church or another religious institution acting as an employer, religious discrimination isn't going to be something that you should have at top of mind, because different rules apply to your organization as it relates to the ability to discuss and otherwise kind of have present in the work environment religious doctrines, religious pictures, images, kind of just religion in general is going to be available to you without these restrictions. But I want to focus in much more on secular employers. Now, secular employers are going to be required to follow Title VII. And we know that Title VII provides that employers shall not discriminate as to the terms and conditions of employment on account of religion. Now, recall that terms and conditions doesn't just mean hiring, firing, promotion. It means the day-to-day work activities. Does the person have to walk into work every day and look at a menorah? Do they need to walk into work every day and see a nativity scene? Those are terms and conditions regarding kind of the employment itself, because it is what is present in the work environment. If you're in the retail setting, right, you're going to want to think about songs and titles that aren't religiously affiliated. You're going to want probably more Grammy got ran over by a reindeer versus Ava Maria, okay, because that's going to have implications. So think about the atmosphere. That's one of our follow law terms, right? The atmosphere that you're creating, and whether or not that atmosphere can adversely affect someone's work environment and it's religious in nature. Now, there may be some people in the seminar right now who are like, I have less than 15 employees, so Title VII doesn't apply to me. And they'd be correct, but you also need to remember that state anti-discrimination laws also protect individuals from discrimination on account of religious beliefs. And that, at least in Maine, and actually in all of New England, for all of our New England employers, if you have one or more employees, that's what's going to be the standard in determining whether or not you have obligations to provide a work environment free from discrimination on the basis of religious beliefs. Consider not just, so when we're talking about the risk itself, we're going to be thinking about days off. Okay, what is the holiday schedule? We're going to be thinking about the day in which we hold the party. in addition to decorations, music, and just the general, not just at the party, but also the work environment more generally. And we should keep this at top of mind, not only as it relates to our employees and providing a safe work environment that's not in violation of Title VII or the Main Human Rights Act, but also potential public accommodation claims as it relates to if you have the public entering the work environment. Let's jump to the next slide, because we've talked about what the risk is, but you're thinking to yourself, Tawny, I'm attending this for you not just to tell me the problems, but also to help me provide solutions, right? So some of the ways in which we can limit risks associated with religious claims, especially during the holiday season, is with the titles, the topics that we put to advertise different events. So instead of a Christmas party, call it a holiday party, because you may have team members who don't celebrate Christmas. They celebrate one of the host of other religious-based holidays that occur in the November, December, January timeframe, right? One of the questions that we get very often when we talk about this topic is, well, wait a second. With a holiday party, does that mean that I have to encompass every single religious holiday that comes between November and January if I'm doing a holiday party? And the answer is no, because we're really trying to get away from celebrating one holiday, one religious holiday at all. We're doing it as a much more general kind of holiday party, not a Christmas party, not a Hanukkah party, not a Kwanzaa party. We're focusing in more generally on all the holidays that come into effect at this time of year, not just religious holidays, but other days which people may want to celebrate as well. One of the other questions that we often get is, should I ask employees what holidays they celebrate in order to be more inclusive? We know that we're talking a lot about DEI initiatives and doing surveys of our workforce to understand what they value and what they believe to be important. This is not one of those situations where you're going to want to reach out and find out every holiday that individuals celebrate. The reason is because, again, we're getting away from the religious nature of these holidays and we're doing a much more general holiday party, right? The holiday party doesn't have to be in this season. It could be that you do a holiday party kind of in July or in March, and that may be related to other holidays in that time frame, but most often we see it in this kind of end of year time frame in order to start the next year or the new year off with a bang. Remember, I mean, when we look at New Year's, that's not on its face a religious holiday. So we're really looking kind of more generalities. When we're talking about a holiday party specifically, we should be aware of scheduling. So make sure that we're not scheduling, if it's a after hours holiday party, if it's after sundown, make sure that we're not scheduling it during a religious holiday, because most likely we're going to have employees who are going to want to be with their family celebrating the holiday party. For a lot of Christians, it would be very similar to, hey, we're going to have our holiday party on the morning of December 25th. That, to most people, doesn't make sense in the same way that scheduling it during one of the nights of Hanukkah isn't fair and doesn't make sense. So when we talk about inclusion, it's not about asking people about what holidays they celebrate. It's more generally acknowledging all these holidays that are occurring and trying to find a time that doesn't interfere with operations and people's kind of religious or non-religious celebrations. We're also going to want to stay away from terms that could connotate a preference towards one religion or another, right? This is something to be really mindful of, especially when we're talking about holiday cards that organizations might send out, whether or not that's a physical card or it is something that is going electronically to team members. So like Christ, the reason for the season, that's fine for individuals to be sending out, but from an organization is going to send a message that most likely is going to be non-inclusive for your non-Christian team members. Be aware of decorations. Earlier, kind of when I talked about risk and I said, terms and conditions of employment, you walk into your office and you see the menorah, or you see a nativity scene, or you see the Star of David. All these things, right, have religious connotations. Instead of trying to have decorations that incorporate every single religious holiday that happens in December, because I promise you, you're going to miss some. Instead, keep it secular, okay? Have your reindeer, have a snowman, right? Keep like those type of images. You can have birch trees, have snow, do those type of things. And I know a lot of our Florida clients are thinking to themselves, have snow, where am I going to get that? But that type of scene for the holidays. And then finally, you know, going back to atmosphere, when we're talking about the atmosphere, movies that may be playing, whether or not you're doing family parties for children or it's just playing up on a screen, or music, make sure that we're limiting faith-based songs. And again, keeping that type of entertainment and atmosphere more secular in nature. You know, let's jump to another thing that we should keep at top of mind. Emily, what's something else that we should keep at top of mind on this next slide?
Yeah, so next we're going to transition and talk about wage and hour claims. So the risk here really is an employee coming forward after a holiday event and with a claim for failure to pay wages. And where you're really going to see this come up is going to be with hourly non-exempt employees under the Fair Labor Standards Act. So just a reminder, those are employees that would be entitled to overtime pay after working 40 hours in a week. But it's really important to remember that even if you don't have hourly exempt employees, you could potentially face a claim from a salaried employee who claims that they're improperly categorized as salary exempt employees when really they should be hourly non-exempt employees. So what's relevant here is that the standard under the Fair Labor Standards Act and Maine law is whether an employee is suffered or permitted to work. And that really means when an employer requires or allows employees to work, that time is hours worked. So, you know, if a claim comes after a holiday party, the court is going to look at what activities occurred during that holiday party to see if those activities look like work or does it look like a party. So an example of something here that could be potentially an issue would be if during the holiday party there is a presentation given by you know, a business leader that's going through metrics or goals for 2023. That might start to look to an outside party like that's a business meeting, not necessarily a party. So, you know, that could potentially be seen as you know, suffering employees to work. Or perhaps you have, you know, a party where there isn't necessarily a formal presentation, but the environment is such that it kind of feels like an extension of the workday and not really a delineation between the workday and a party. And that could look like it's permitting employees to work under that type of a situation. And how this would manifest in a risk would be a claim for failure to compensate for time worked, untimely payment of wages, or failure to pay overtime, depending on the hours that employee worked that week. And where this really gets tough for employers about wage and hour claims, it's that the damages here are very significant. So they could be treble damages plus attorney's fees for these types of claims. So it's a significant risk, but there are things that you can do to reduce it. So if we could flip to the next slide, please, we'll go through that. So what's important to keep in mind here is first to keep the event voluntary. So I would highly recommend, you can even include this on the invitation, or you can put this in the email that goes out to employees notifying them about the holiday party. There's no expectation that you are required to attend this event. Along with that, what can also be helpful is if you do have an hourly non-exempt population, is sharing whether employees will be paid or not right in that communication. So it's very clear upfront, you're not going to get paid for this. It's a voluntary event. And then people can kind of make a decision on whether or not they plan to attend. In terms of, as Tawny was saying before, the vibe, focus on the celebration. So, use another time during the workday to talk about presentations or information sharing for the next year. During this time that you're focusing on the holiday party, like make it about the party. And what gets kind of tricky here is making sure that all of your managers are on the same page. So if you as a company have a message that this is a voluntary event, you want to make sure that your managers aren't saying anything to contradict that. So, that could be a manager saying, no, I really want everyone there, but it could also be a manager saying, hey guys, like, it's going to look really great if we all show up to this party, like, come, like, won't, our boss be, so thrilled that we're all there. I think, just getting everyone to be on the same page about the fact that the event is voluntary, and acknowledging that, that type of pressure might not be, you have to come to the party. It could be a little more subtle, is important to make sure that the messaging is consistent. And to further show that the event is voluntary, some other things to really keep in mind could be hosting the event at an offsite location, either after hours or on the weekend, just to get you out of the usual work environment, make it clear it's a different situation. You also could consider inviting significant others and family members. It's hard to have an event that's completely focused on, work when you have people that aren't part of the company there. It might create a more relaxed environment where work isn't front and center. And all of these will really just kind of contribute to less work talk and more celebration, which will make it clear to employees and, possibly to a third party observer down the line if you do face a claim that the party is not paid time.
Just to add on to that, Emily, as well, I think, Emily makes some really good points about like getting managers on the same page. And I think this is what we oftentimes see leads to the most issues. But be mindful when you're planning events too, when you're looking at team, a lot of times people be like, oh, this will be fun and also team building, right? It does those two areas or avenues, and they'll say, okay, you divide up into your work teams, and then whoever builds the sculpture first, or whoever does the relay race faster, something like that. When you're dividing people up into teams like that, into the work teams, it then becomes something where it's like, well, wait a second, not all my teams here. That's not fair. Last year, they didn't come either. And then there's peer pressure. I know it sounds very like middle school, but that peer pressure. So even if you have managers on the same page, if you have events that are either for team building or where you're segregating or separating people based off of who they work with normally or departments, that's also going to give a message to people like, wait, if my team isn't here, then that becomes, I'm limited in additional ways. So instead, if you're doing games or if you're doing trivia, those type of things, mingle, make sure that you have different departments integrated with other departments so that you're not either limiting one team because not everyone came, or giving an advantage to a team that had the whole team show up, because that's going to make it seem less voluntary. Instead integrate people. But that's some really good points there, Emily. Let's jump and talk a little bit about injury. And I would presume a lot of you are thinking to yourself, okay, Tawny, this was what came to top of mind as soon as I was thinking about a holiday party. And when we talk about injury, we're actually looking at it from two different perspectives. We're going to look at injury to self as it relates to our employees. So like our employees injuring themselves at a holiday party or as a result of a holiday party. But we also have to think about injury to others, other third parties who are unrelated to the organization, whether or not that be spouses, partners, children of employees, or random third parties. It could be people who are serving on the event staff, if you're having it catered, or the bartender, or it could be just somebody randomly on the street outside of the event, or somebody who's injured while an employee is on their way home. So those are the when we say others and self is going to be employees, and then others are going to be people who are not employees but somehow are physically in the same area either during the party or after the holiday party. For injury to self, there's three main kind of areas that I want you to consider and keep at top of mind when we go through and talk about how to limit risk. The first element is going to be like joyous, oops, I hurt myself, right? So you're playing Twister at the holiday party, and you're not going to be surprised, but the next slide is going to recommend that we not play Twister at holiday parties, but let's do other like fun reindeer games, okay, that you may come to decide is fun. Or maybe it's not even games, but it's just something that maybe is a different type of movement or more strenuous, or maybe the seats at the location are a lot lower than what people are used to. It doesn't have to be something that's joyous. Slip and fall, especially in New England. We're looking at icier conditions. Has there been sanding and salting? Entering and exiting facilities generally. Then once people are inside, are there wet boots that are making puddles? Are there drinks that have been spilt kind of all over the floor that could lead to other slip and falls? So slip and falls, always something that is at top of mind when we're talking about injury and liability. We have the games, the Twister and the reindeer games, and then unfortunately car accidents. It would be the next large category. Usually this would be following an event, and most oftentimes either an event that has gone well into the night or one in which alcohol is involved in. So those are kind of the risks, very, very generally. As it relates to our employees. As it relates to injury to others, the two primary categories we're going to see are car accidents, unfortunately, either late at night when individuals are tired or when there's alcohol involved more generally. And then physical violence. This one might seem as though it doesn't make sense. Why do we have a higher likelihood of physical violence when we're at a party? This could be related to involvement of alcohol. It also could involve other types of harassment that may be occurring. It also could be that people are outside of the work environment and maybe are treating it as an atmosphere that is not work related, and therefore are uncovering, and their true selves may be ones which are ones that enjoy more physical violence, and directing that either towards other employees or towards third parties. So let's talk a little bit about how we can limit liability concerning injury. Now, mitigating workers' comp claims, that's going to be that category of injury to self or to the employees. Recall that for workers' compensation purposes, the injury is going to be covered if it was incurred in the pursuit of an activity, the major purpose of which is social or recreational, that means that it's going to not be covered, by workers' comp. So that's going to be outside the course of workers' comp. In determining whether or not the major purpose was social or recreational, location and time are going to play a role, as are whether or not we are, as an organization, or the host. Whether or not the injury itself was part of a work-related game or activity. So that goes to some of the other things that Emily talked about related to wage and hour. Some organizations choose to do their holiday party in the middle of the day. It makes it less likely that there's an expectation that alcohol will be there. But if that's happening, if it's in the middle of the normal workday, it then is less likely to be considered social or recreational. So workers' comp would likely apply. Wage and hour laws would be applicable, and you'd be paying people for the time in which they're working. And there's benefits to kind of having a holiday party that's set up like that. There's also benefits, however, to having a holiday party that may be after hours, that may be unrelated to the work, and having people unwind a little. Oftentimes when we see the latter type of holiday party, alcohol is involved. When we're talking about limiting risk, I would be remiss if I didn't say, consider not serving alcohol as the first way to decrease some of that liability. If you are serving alcohol, potentially consider a ticket system. Use some type of last call, permitting significant time between when that last call is and when the event ends, to help people make sure that they're eating and drinking and that they are sober to drive home kind of after the event. If you don't use a ticket system, or you don't and you do choose to serve alcohol, also consider what type of alcohol that you're serving. In the past, we've said, like, maybe you want it just to be beer and wine and no hard alcohol. I think specifically kind of in New England at this point in time, if you are considering doing just beer and wine, but the purpose is to decrease the likelihood that you'll have somebody who becomes inebriated quickly, be very mindful of the type of beer that you're serving, that you have, more 4% ABV beers as opposed to 9 or 11% beers, because you oftentimes will have employees who have, hey, I had 2 beers, I drink 2 beers at home all the time, and it's not an issue. But if they're drinking 2 9% beers, that could be a bigger issue. If you do choose to serve alcohol, also make sure that you're offering food and that you're offering non-alcoholic beverages as well. Soda, iced tea, sparkling waters, all of those type of things as well, so that people who choose not to drink do have other options during the course of the event. As to insurance, depending on where you're holding the event, whether or not you're holding it on site or at a third party, make sure that you have liability insurance that protects you if alcohol is being served on site, or if you're hosting an event in which alcohol is being served. In most situations, a general liability policy will cover it, but you do need to double check that, because there may be situations that are excluded. Beware always of employees who, quote unquote, pre-gamed, or who arrived at the event intoxicated already, or who may be sneaking alcohol into the event. That's also going to be, problematic for the situation. Also, and this is one of the biggest kind of general overarching things, is if you're going to have alcohol, and even if you're going to have a ticket system or a last call, you're going to have food, you're going to have beverages, be mindful that we need people to have a safe way to get home. Okay, That could be designated drivers. And if those designated drivers are employees, you better make sure that they're being paid for the whole event, all the time in which they're spent driving people home. Have taxi numbers available, indicate to people that you'll reimburse for taxis, do Uber discounts for employees. Also make sure that you have a way in which employees can get home without shame, that you have an organization that's psychologically safe so that people don't feel as though there's any shame in saying, I had too much to drink, I need assistance in getting home. Be mindful though that if you're assisting someone in getting home, that they're going to need access in a lot of cases to a vehicle at some point in the future. So assist in getting them back to their vehicle the next day in some format. Again, that may be an Uber discount. It could be reimbursing for taxis, designated drivers in the morning. All of those things are potential ways, but making sure that you've created a culture and an atmosphere where people truly do feel safe coming to designated individuals to ask for that help. So that's a little bit about how we're going to mitigate workers' compensation claims, but let's talk a little bit about mitigating third-party injury. Again, this is most likely going to occur when alcohol is involved, so I'm going to focus in a lot on that. And when we talk about mitigating third-party injury, I'm now talking more about how do we guarantee as much as possible that when someone gets in a car that they're not going to get into an accident and injure a third party. On your Follow Less standard, you'll see on the second page that there are some real life examples of liability issues that have occurred in New England. And one of those cases is Berry v. Dixfield Convalescent Center, and that's a 1983 case in Maine. But what happened was the employee sued their employer after they drank in excess, and then they themselves, the employee, was involved in a car accident that ultimately killed, unfortunately, his wife. So he was driving the car, he was intoxicated. Unfortunately, his wife dies, but he successfully sues his employer. Okay, so be mindful that when we're dealing with people getting in a car, we're not just thinking about our employees, but we're also thinking about third parties who could be injured as a result of our employees' activities and ways in which they could then attempt to hold us accountable. In most cases, it's not going to be from a dram shot, from a, we serve the individual and therefore are liable, but more as an agent. Similarly, remember that even if they ultimately aren't successful, the time and energy that you're going to spend defending a claim like that in and of itself is going to be problematic and take away from your ability to operate the organization. Next, if you open up the party to spouses or guests, families, there's also the possibility of liability as it relates to them injuring themselves on the premise. So make sure that you have appropriate insurance prior to hosting parties on site, and make sure that whoever you're contracting with, if you're doing it with a third party or a vendor, that they also have liability insurance for the event. If you're a small employer and you're considering having it at someone's home, right, there's another host and layer of risk that could occur there, not just as it relates to third-party injuries, but kind of all of the topics we've discussed. And Emily's going to get into sex harassment as being one of the big concerns there, but make sure that wherever you're hosting the event, that there's insurance in place to protect against issues that may occur related to the employee themselves and to third parties. With that, Emily, I kind of did a little bit of a lead into it, but let's talk a little bit about sex harassment.
Sure. So sex harassment is going to come up in one of two ways. As a reminder, the first one is hostile work environment. So that really is going to occur when the work environment is intimidating, hostile, or offensive to reasonable people. And how can this come up in a holiday party context? Dancing could be an area in which it comes up if there's improper touching between coworkers or dance moves. And to mention, this could be between two coworkers, or it could be something that the employee is doing themselves. Another area of risk could be close talking. If we have an employee who's not conscious of boundaries with other employees, and is getting too physically close to other coworkers or employees, that could be a potential issue. Gifts is another area, depending on what the gift is, and specifically in this area, I think sometimes there will be, gift exchanges where there are like gag gifts, and those can kind of cross a line sometimes if we're not careful about what's appropriate and what's not in these types of situations. And then the last thing for hostile work environment could also be, thank yous that are, well-intentioned, but could make other people feel uncomfortable if they're just, too much. And then one other thing I would actually add under hostile environment too would be games. So Tawny had mentioned, Twister at the beginning of the conversation here today. And, I think other games as well should always kind of be just triple checked that there's not going to be an element of it that makes people feel uncomfortable. On the other hand, we also have quid pro quo harassment, and that's, the sex harassment that we're familiar with as being a little, more concrete. So managers bullying an employee to attend the party, and the employee feels like, their job is on the line if they choose not to go. And that kind of gets back to all that wage and hour stuff too, potentially. And then the second example here are, kind of challenges or situations where managers might encourage inappropriate behavior and offer, whether seriously or jokingly or what have you, but they offer a raise or promotion in the context of engaging in that type of a behavior. So here, whoever gets, employee A drunk first gets a raise. Those are the types of things that we're looking for in this category. In terms of how to mitigate that on the next slide, there's several things that you can do. So the first thing is to be direct with employees concerning expectations before the event. We're all working with adults, so you would hope that you don't have to do that, but it is something that we would recommend to limit your liability, is explain to employees that this is a work function. Employees should behave in a similar manner to how they would behave at any other day at work, even though it's a celebration. This is another area too, where the party location is important. So, try to avoid venues that could potentially create a hostile atmosphere. Some of these are, kind of traditionally provocative locations like strip clubs or casinos, but also bars potentially could create that type of an environment. So it's just important to think about. Another area to kind of help mitigate some liability could be inviting spouses, significant others, and family. It's likely not as conducive of an environment for sex harassment if the employee has their family physically present at the event. We also, have some decor around this time of the year, like mistletoe, that probably shouldn't be incorporated into a company party. Just, better to avoid anything like that that has a connotation of any kind of physical intimacy. And finally, refraining from physical activities that could create a hostile environment. So as Tawny said before, Twister and alcohol is not a great choice. And any other, type of game that could potentially involve touching or something that would, in playing, would make people feel uncomfortable in other ways.
And it's interesting, Emily. I mean, the one about inviting spouses and significant others, it's tough because what we hear from so many clients is, we would love to do that. We used to do that, but financially it's not feasible anymore. So understanding that, I mean, one of the reasons why spouses and significant others, and including kind of third parties at holiday events, is so often when we talk about this topic, we say, would you have done that if so-and-so's spouse was there? Would you have done that if so-and-so's partner was there? Would you have done it if your partner or spouse was there? And the answer consistently is no, right? Similarly, something that Emily mentioned on the last slide was regarding almost those white elephant or gift exchanges, right? Very often we'll see that as a time in which very inappropriate gag gifts are given. And it becomes more difficult for us to figure out who the bad actor is, right? Because it's a gift exchange where maybe the person who brought that gift is unknown. Someone thinks they're doing it as a gag or something funny, and it's not. But we see that less likely to happen when there's third parties who are unknown to the potential harasser who are going to be there. And it goes back to one of the things that we talk about a lot when we're dealing with sexual harassment, which is very rarely do we see a sexual harassment claim made on day 1 or day 2 of employment, because instead people quote unquote get comfortable and then think that it's okay to harass, but until they're comfortable with the person, they may not choose to make those bad decisions. We see it much more often, however, later in employment, and especially kind of at holiday and more jovial events. But when we add different people into the mix, that behavior is less likely to occur. So something to keep in mind, if it's at all financially feasible to allow people to bring spouses, whether they choose to or not, a way in which you can very easily, more expensively, however, limit that liability. Let's jump to things that we should really be considering. And I like to say, after the party, it's the after party, because it's an area of concern that I think is so often overlooked. And in large part, there is all the hustle and bustle to plan a holiday party. Then there's a holiday party itself. And then there's kind of that like, whew, that's behind us. Let's move on to New Year's audits. Let's move on to all the other things that I had kind of pushed. But doing an after party assessment is really, really important. And the reason it's important is because it gives you, I think, a good sense of culturally where your organization is at. Was this holiday party just the dullest, saddest thing that you've ever seen? If that's the case, you likely have a very large kind of cultural issue or a void. And assessing and understanding why was that the feel of what should be like a fun and exciting event, why was it so drab? Emily, what are some of your thoughts as to like why you could have an event that just like has gone sideways and afterwards nobody is happy? And in that situation, sometimes I question, does it make sense to pay money for a holiday party if that's what it looks like?
Yeah, Tawny, I think it could be a bunch of different reasons. But, for me, the one that kind of stands out might be that people don't feel comfortable in that type of an environment where, you aren't kind of relying on work topics to kind of carry you through the event. And, I think we spend so much of our times at work that it really is something where if you're feeling like people just aren't enjoying each other's company, or it just feels really kind of hard to get through, that might be an opportunity for, more formal team bonding or team activities, built in throughout the year to kind of get to a point where people have that level of familiarity.
I think those are all really good points. And specifically as it relates to like individuals, don't look at just as a whole, like why was it, let's use it as an example, Emily and I at a holiday party. after the event, if I realized, gosh, Emily was sitting over in a corner by herself for most of the event, and I didn't really see her engaging or interacting with people. Why is that? Emily and I have had cases in which that's part of the scenario, and that is one element of a larger harassment or discrimination claim, where it's later alleged that the reason that nobody engaged with them at the holiday party was because they're a whistleblower, because of their gender, because of their religion, or another protected classification. Really kind of in human resources, part of your job as well at these holiday parties is to make sure that people feel as though it's an inclusive environment. Make sure you can't force people to have fun. I promise you, I do understand that forced fun is not fun, but this is a good way for you to take the temperature of your employees, your team, and even if it's not directly taking their temperature, are you having fun? Look at body language, look at the atmosphere. Did people leave an hour before the event was scheduled to be done? What does that tell you about the event? And understanding that a party for party's sake isn't always going to be, and in most cases won't be, a benefit for employees. So you've put a lot of time and energy into something where you're getting very little concern. Very little return, not concern. Now, the other thing that sometimes, unfortunately, employers may be responsible for after the party is complaints, investigations. So-and-so gave me elevator eyes. This person made inappropriate jokes or comments. I heard somebody talking about religion and they were upset that it was a holiday party, and they think that's all because of Christians being upset that not everyone wants to celebrate their holiday. Whatever reason kind of that is, very timely investigate those complaints, okay? Because if those complaints are brought to human resources attention and nothing occurs as a result of those complaints, people are going to stop communicating. They're not going to communicate about the bigger issues. And some of the bigger issues may have occurred at that party, but you're not going to hear about harassment, discrimination, retaliation, some of those big concepts that we are consistently afraid of. And when we're asking people to let loose, with hope is going to be a time in which we see if we do have issues, and that could be bigger cultural issues because nobody does let loose, or on the opposite end of the spectrum, cultural issues related to people being too loose with their behavior and not treating it like a work environment. With that, we do have a couple of extra minutes. I know people are surprised because normally I'm talking right up until that very last minute, but Emily and I are happy to stick around and answer any questions that people may have. Otherwise, we thank you so very much for attending today. We hope you have a lovely holiday season, and we're here for questions. Throw them up into the Q&A or into the chat. And otherwise, you'll get a copy of all the slides, the fa la la standard, as well as a copy of the recording later this week. Thank you. Do we have any liability at this point? That's a great question. So kind of goes to, I laughed and said after the party, it's the after party, which is really just you assessing the party. But we know that in certain situations, there truly will be an after party. This is going to be one of those areas where you want to get managers on the same page. A manager should not be rallying the troops to go to an after party, because that is going to have hints of work-related, necessary, arguments that could be made that the manager is acting on behalf of the organization, and therefore that it was a manager-sponsored and company-sponsored endeavor. In most situations, that after party is not going to be a place where we have liability from a third-party injury, from like that workers' comp standpoint, even from the wage and hour standpoint. But when we're dealing with sex harassment, because they're employees, we still may have liability and exposure there. Now, if one of our employees at that after party is sexually harassed by a third party and non-employee, it's more tangential. But if we have a group of employees going to a third party, a third location for this after party, and inappropriate behaviors occur there, it would be something that we need to investigate, just like it was at the party that we ourselves hosted. So that's a great question. I had a lawyerly answer, which was, it depends, but I hope I gave you some of the factors that it's going to depend on, including kind of who was there, whether or not there's a manager or someone else who binds the organization, and then what behavior itself is really at issue, or a lot of the factors that we're going to be analyzing and determining liability. But that was definitely a great question, because it is something that we do see happening very often, especially with holiday parties. And it's interesting because sometimes we see it when the employer, the organization has done everything in its power to limit liability, where they've had like a luncheon and an afternoon holiday party and then let people go home early. And there's some people who are just like, no, I'm not going home. Let's all go to the bar and take it through the night. So even when you as an organization have done all of this work in order to minimize the risk, sometimes that rogue employee is just going to unfortunately erase kind of all that work you did. So absolutely great question. Any other questions? Emily and I will stay on for a few more minutes. We'll wait to see if there's any more questions, answer those. Otherwise, we hope that you have a wonderful day.